Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end, as we will hold a 30-minute networking session in the neural network. Here you can meet, ask questions to our distinguished speakers, connect, and chat with the AI for Good community. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Matthias Greschel, and I welcome you to today's webinar, co-organized by the ITU WHO Focus Group on AI for Health and the Department of Biomedical Informatics at Harvard Medical School. If you're interested in learning what the Focus Group is working on or doing, or if you want to learn more about AI for Good, please reach out. We're always looking for people to join the effort, and we're really happy to discuss and work together. I have the immense privilege of introducing today's speaker as part of the AI and Health webinar series, Matt Lungren, who will speak about the gift from yesterday, medical data as a public good. And I really love this title. Dr. Lungren is the principal for clinical AI and ML at AWS Worldwide Public Sector Healthcare. There, he leads the engagement for clinical machine learning collaborations and solutions for all AWS partner organizations around the world. Prior to working for AWS, he was an associate professor and a clinical radiologist at Stanford University. He's led several international efforts to produce data sets in AI for radiology, and has also created or co-created one of the most popular Coursera courses on the fundamentals of machine learning in healthcare. So you may know his name from joining one of his courses. Before giving the floor to Matt, I'd like to encourage everyone who has joined on the neural network to please post questions as short as possible so I can channel them to Matt. And please stick around for the networking session. We will both join to interact with you. All right, with no further ado, Matt, please take it away. I think you're still muted, Matt.
All right, there we go. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect, looks good, here's good.
Great. All right, well, thank you so much for having me. I was really excited for this opportunity. I'm a big fan of this initiative, and of course, believe very strongly in the mission, both just in the healthcare applications, but clearly across the board. There's so much work that we have to do and so many opportunities to tackle. And I think that, some of the things we're going to talk about today, if we apply them well and we keep our sort of mission focused goals in mind, I think we're going to have a very exciting few years ahead of us. So with that, I'm going to talk about data. And it's we like to call it the gift from yesterday, just to sort of put it in perspective. I currently sort of work in a very large tech company right now, but this work and the things I'm going to talk about today are actually not related to my role right now. They're actually related to my work previous to this at Stanford, also with the Radiologic Society of North America, and my adjunct clinical roles, both at UCSF and at Duke. So let's talk about data a little bit. I'm always just fascinated by the amount of data that we're generating in the last couple of decades, and in general, I think that it's hard to wrap our heads around it. A lot of folks like to make analogies to try to get some perspective on how much data we're talking about. And I think in healthcare, some estimates are around 2,300 exabytes, at least it exists in the world right now in terms of healthcare data. And that's increasing at 40 to 50% year over year, which is astonishing. I'm sure you've heard other folks talk about this, where more data has been created in the last 5 years than in all of human history, that kind of stuff. I try to put it more in a physical terms. And what I like to say is, if you had that much data and you put it on iPad Airs, those thin iPads, 250, 60 gig iPad Airs, you could actually stack it 82,000 miles high, which to me, that's just unbelievable, right? And that amount of data, the fact that it's growing in the way that it is is presenting us with incredible opportunities, but also some challenges. And we're going to get into some of the things that surround that in this talk. The reason that data isn't really often used as a sort of a headline kind of talk, or we don't talk about it at least as a lead, is that it's really not typically the most fun part of the work that we do, right? I mean, I've done hundreds of projects, worked with collaborators all over the world, and we rarely get really excited about the real work that goes into a lot of the innovations and the things that we're developing. We like to talk about the new architectures. We love to talk about different techniques. We love to talk about the translation and the impact. But behind the scenes, and this is one example, this sort of graphic here that sort of shows the proportion of the things that we're doing that contribute to any given innovation or project that we work on. And as you can see, between collecting the data sets, cleaning, organizing, and I'd probably throw annotation, at least particularly for healthcare in there, 80 to 90% of our work is spent messing around with data. And again, this is kind of the unsexy stuff, right, that we often don't talk about. It's so incredibly important, so much so that as we're going to talk about later, we've seen where if you don't spend enough time thinking about it, you can be led down the wrong path. And that's incredibly important in healthcare, and really helps us really understand the value and the gravity of the things that we're doing in data. And I guess from my perspective, I like to kind of tell this to a general audience as a story. How is it possible that data is arguably, and I'll probably try to make a case here that it is more important than even the architectures and some of the innovations we've seen in the machine learning space. So this photograph, now I don't know how many folks in this audience would know this. I realize that I don't feel that old, but I guess I'm getting old. So this is a photograph from the 90s. I was in high school when this happened. It was a huge deal. This is Garry Kasparov losing. And he sort of has his hands, head in his hands. He's just lost to Deep Blue. And he was, of course, the chess grandmaster at the time, unbelievable talent. And this was the first time that a computer algorithm was able to beat a human expert. And the headlines after this were astonishing. I mean, again, this is the late 90s, talking about, are we going to have, sort of the end of human knowledge? Are we just going to cede all of our human expert tasks to computer algorithms, right? It was the same kinds of headlines, frankly, that you might be familiar with today. And when you look at what happened, how did this happen? How did they achieve this? I think my instinct would have been, and probably a lot of people might say, hey, they probably had some cool new innovation in machine learning, some new algorithm, right, that they came up with that was able to accomplish this. And it turns out, when you look at what happened, this algorithm they used was really not that sophisticated. In fact, even at the time, it was pretty old. It was 14 years old at the time. So they used this architecture. But they had tried for a really long time to achieve this task. And it wasn't until a large data set of chess games was made open to the public that they were able to use that data and train this relatively old model in a way that allowed it to achieve expert human performance, in this case, beat it, right? And that accelerated that progress. Again, it wasn't some necessarily new innovation beyond just the access and the availability and the organization of that data. I'm going to give you another use case. This one you might remember from 2011, when, again, Watson is now beating humans at Jeopardy, right? Which is, not necessarily the most straightforward task for machine learning tools, right? And again, the model that was used at the time was 20 years old, and you might wonder how did it take so long? Well, it just became that they just didn't have access to enough data in the right form to achieve what they needed to, right? And then in 2009, Project Gutenberg, which you may remember that name, that was actually the project that meant to digitize and open source as many books as possible. And then, of course, we're all familiar with Wikipedia. Both of those things started coming into their maturity. And using that data, it only took a couple years, again, with that older algorithm, to achieve, again, and surpass human level performance. So again, this is really just to drive home how important the data is in this sort of innovation cycle, right? It's really, really important. And putting another point on it, the fact that it was open and available, right, was critical. And of course, I know all of you know about ImageNet, right? This is really what has accelerated. In fact, it's the reason I'm sitting here today, the reason many of you might be here today. Fei-Fei Li's idea around making a massive data set, in this case of images, with some structured labels available to the world, and in order to leverage machine learning to sort of do image classification, it was astonishing that it hadn't been done before, and in retrospect seems so obvious, right? But of course, she actually fought for quite a long time to get folks to agree that this was the right path, and to really engage the community. And then we're going to talk about this a little bit later. Is how do you really engage the community? One great way to do that is a challenge, right? Make it a competition. And I think many of you are familiar with the ImageNet challenge. For many years, right, folks would compete with different entries in terms of trying to achieve human level classification performance for a variety of tasks. Microsoft Research was the first to achieve this in 2015, sort of surpassed in the human error rate. There's a lot more story to this, but I think just in general, you're getting the picture that having the data allowed these innovations to happen. In fact, now we had the resurgence, as many of you know, of some of the convolutional neural networks and models. And again, just to sort of give you that same timeline perspective, the convolutional neural network was not invented in 2015, right? This was a relatively old thought process. In fact, you probably could tag it to being even earlier. But in general, it was the availability of that massive data set that allowed us to unlock this innovation. And in general, and we're seeing how the field has really transformed. So not to oversell it, but really data is so critical, so critical. And I think that, you've heard this before, right? Data is the new oil. And it's also one of the reasons why there are lots of folks from tech companies everywhere who are looking for the data, trying to access the data, trying to get to a place where, there's enough data to achieve some of these other tasks that we're going to be talking about now in healthcare. But, I don't think that it's like oil. And I think a lot of people would agree. I think that in general, we like to say that because of the economic value that goes into it. But ultimately, it's a pretty unhelpful description because it kind of makes it seem like it's a zero-sum game, and it's not. If you kind of use economic terms around it, you would use terms like, for digital data, you would use terms like non-exclusionary and non-rivalrous. And what those really mean is that, if you are making a data set available, it doesn't take away someone else's opportunity to also use that same data, right? It's replicable. And other folks can benefit of just as well as you can in most cases, right? So it's not a traditional form of property. And I think that is a difficult mindset to start to, wrap your head around, but it's so important. It can't be consumed and then it's gone, right? But really ownership becomes the crux of the issue. It's about rights to control access to it and rights to the share of the profit off of whatever that data is ends up generating. And it's really that locking or exclusive access, those kinds of sort of non-open approaches that really make it a scarcity, right? And that's actually what's driving this sort of, I guess, the analogies to oil, right? And that's I think is unfair, and I think that we'll eventually be on the wrong side of history. So when we think about health data, then there are schools of thought. Now, there's many more opinions than the two that I'm kind of showing, but I try to put these into a couple buckets. What you typically hear, there are folks that advocate that patients should own the data, and that every patient should have to give explicit consent to the use of that data, whether it's de-identified or not. And there's several fair arguments for that. There's also the idea that providers, healthcare systems, other aggregators, they actually own the data, right? And it can be bought and sold like any other commodity. It's not necessarily tied to the patient at that point. I think that from my work at Stanford and what we believed at Stanford, at least in general, we came to the conclusion that anyone who interacts with data becomes a data steward. And we have responsibilities to both patients, but also to society. Because as I showed you earlier, these data can unlock accelerations in innovation that can't be achieved with small one-off use cases. We really need a large data set in most cases to achieve some of the innovations that we want to see. And those innovations then would come back and benefit the patients. And so, we believe that once the data has been used for its primary purpose, which is to take care of a patient, then it becomes possible for secondary use to drive further innovation. So this is where we sort of say medical data as a public good. But in order for it to be valuable and have impact, it has to be available. If we look at the clinical, pandemic's an awesome use case, and we're going to use it frequently through this talk. But if you think about, there were around 10,000 clinical trials focusing on COVID around the world. But the overwhelming majority of those, the data sets were too small to really enable true insights for health outcomes. And that's when I think a lot of this tide has turned. If I had given this talk in 2019, I think this would still be hard to imagine it would be useful for a general audience. But now I believe that what we've seen happen, particularly around the large aggregated data sets and the advancements and the insights we've been able to derive, I think we're in a place now where this does start to make sense. And I think a lot of people would agree, right? So there's massive amounts of momentum behind medical data as a public good. And there are many governments advocating for sort of a larger social contract for data sharing, particularly in medicine. And this starts to lead to infrastructure, right? And I think that what they're saying is, at this point, the lack of availability of these data sets, the fragmentation, the lack of interoperability, all kind of, again, really accelerated by the pandemic, I think made everyone realize that we have to get this straight. It's not just about throwing data into a large aggregated pool. That's not going to get the job done, as we'll talk about. It's actually trying to find innovative ways, and potentially in some cases reinventing how we're storing, how we're organizing, and how we're using the data so that it does benefit everybody. But to do that, you have to get a lot of people to agree on shared principles, right? There has to be governance models. These are some of the things that now become a human problem as opposed to a tech problem. But I do believe, and I think that in general, what we're starting to see is a convergence amongst governments, leaders around the world, that an open and trustworthy health data landscape will enable a lot of innovation for everybody to benefit from. There are a lot of examples that I could show you. I could show you UK Biobank, all of us. I could show you Gen 3 and N3C, all kinds of different opportunities where data has been made more available. And certainly governments have really tried to lead the way in this space. But I really want to sort of home in on the MIMIC data set. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. I would expect that many of you are. This is a data set of de-identified health records, very comprehensive, from patients in the ICU from Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston. It's now on its 4th generation, now including both chest X-rays and those reports for those chest X-rays. So it's an incredibly rich and valuable data set. And I would argue that more papers, more innovation, and more final solution sort of algorithms have been developed from this data set than probably any other in the world. It actually only contains 52,000 patients, right? Which is incredible to think that we're really all this innovation, so almost several fields are kind of standing on this relatively small foundation, but we're obviously drawing more insights with new data. But in general, this is one of the models, right? And for countless people in academia and industry, I think the availability of this has really helped us understand what is potentially possible. And I think even more importantly, where our limitations are and what more data could potentially do for us. And as we've tried, at least at Stanford and some other institutions, to try to continue to enrich data sets that are interoperable with MIMIC, and to create insights that allow us to understand concepts around generalizability and bias, as we'll talk about a little bit later. So again, kudos to this team. I mean, this was done well before all of these discussions now, and I believe still is, in my opinion, one of the gold standards in terms of making data sets available to researchers around the world. I think a lot of people sort of say, okay, well, this is great, but why? Do we really need to have medical data as a public good in order to achieve advancements? Can't we just leave it up to the individual labs and researchers that are affiliated with, academic medical centers, for example, or pharmaceutical companies, et cetera? I think that's a fair point, but as we'll start to see, and as I'm going to kind of unroll this thought process, the idea around collaboration and value doesn't necessarily need to be an either or. There are technologic opportunities to leverage data that may need to stay within a singular governance system. And I think that the realization around, particularly around generalizability, but then also rare or uncommon use cases start to become very problematic in this field, right? And the ability to encourage collaboration and build value, whether it's a federated infrastructure or whether it's an aggregate infrastructure, really is going to be critical if we're going to see the kind of progress that we want. We also believe that just trying to achieve this, all of these groups coming together, all these governments, all these academics like myself and others, talking about this and trying to work on this problem, even if we aren't able to achieve the ultimate goal of universal interoperability, what it does is making us take a hard look at something we don't often spend a lot of time looking at. And again, as I opened the talk, we don't really spend a lot of time thinking critically about our data. And then that deferred maintenance over the past decade or two that we've been in digital healthcare has really started to show the consequences to us now, right? We don't have really robust systems of interoperability, and that is actually hampering a lot of research. And so having a strategic focus, having a plan, having a roadmap, talking about this and figuring out ways to do this is a huge step. And again, even if we don't achieve the full extent of what we know we could do, we'll still make a lot more progress working on open data as a public good, as opposed to trying to build our own infrastructure in silos. And again, that leads you to sort of the fragmentation. The UN has been absolutely on top of this. It's part of sustainable goals in the future. And I think we're going to make progress towards some of those, in particular around some of the concepts of democratizing access to both the data, but then also the resultant innovation that can potentially be used to benefit people around the world. I think that when it comes to health data, and I'm guilty of this, I sort of, for many years, operated on the assumption, okay, well, we need, genomics and imaging and electronic health and maybe wearables, right? Something like that. That probably in my head comprised what health data was. And then I started learning a lot about the opportunities for leveraging other related data about people and ecosystems and the environment that actually contribute massively to health. In our country, in the US, and I'm a public health, also I have a public health degree, and we talk a lot about how a vast majority of the healthcare issues that we observe with our patients and populations tends to be related to socioeconomic factors. In fact, up to 80%. That's significant, right? So if we're only trying to derive particularly population level health insights and advancements, and we're only focusing on the data of those intermittent interactions with the healthcare system, we are potentially missing out on 80% of the information that could help us help our patients and potentially unlock the power of public health. So, but this starts to get a little controversial, right? Because some of this data, one of my mentors at Stanford used to call this data exhaust. So your geolocation data, your Facebook, your Google searches, right? All of those kinds of other data about you, your shopping, commerce, right? Where you live. Those things end up being relatively important. And again, the pandemic really sort of provided opportunities around the world to leverage the ubiquitous nature of the smartphone to, for example, track individuals, try to predict outbreaks, not just with COVID, but in Kenya, there was a project that looked at 15 million people with smartphones to try to track malaria infection. I mean, so the opportunities are incredible, but we have to start considering the entire data ecosystem, not just the times when folks are interacting with the healthcare system, if we're really thinking about coming up with a comprehensive approach. And this isn't necessarily new. There are many, this is an example of the types of other data that have been used during the pandemic for outbreak around the world, or looking at public health questions. Countries like South Korea, Ghana, Mozambique, they all use de-identified phone data in many different papers and use cases to combat the pandemic, usually in coordination with international aid organizations or healthcare organizations, right? And understanding how those data interact with health unlocks an entirely new conversation around what kind of data really qualifies for health data. One of the things I want to talk about then, when we sort of think about open data, is we're developing applications from it, right? So like, we are innovating all over the world in commercial and academic circles with the data that we're able to access. But when you take a hard look at the majority of the solutions or applications that have been trained, and look more carefully about where the data has come from to train those applications, you're starting to see with this chart a little bit of inequity, right? This was actually a figure from a paper published by some colleagues at MIT and BID, and they looked at all the clinical, medical, and surgical manuscripts that leverage AI techniques. A pretty broad bucket. They found 30,000 articles up through 2019, and after identifying, all the clinical manuscripts, they looked at the data set descriptions. And this figure was really representative of the country of origin of the data that was used to train and validate the algorithms. And you can see that only a handful of countries are really represented here. This does not reflect, right, the gravity of the population in the world. And 40% of them, I think, as you can see, were trained in the United States. And so now you're starting to see, are we heading towards developing knowledge that doesn't necessarily benefit everybody if we're developing it from data from only a few places? And I love this map from an article that sort of kind of tried to redraw the global data picture, right? Sort of inflating those that contribute the most data to some of these solutions that we're seeing or potentially even using, versus the places that haven't contributed data. And that matters. And for those of you in this field, you'll understand certainly how important this is. And we'll talk a little bit about the biases that can occur. But even if you look at the US alone and say, hey, well, what about the things that we're building and training on US data sets? Can that be at least used across our country? And this is a fantastic insight into that, where some researchers out of Stanford, some of my colleagues, they looked at 70 publications that compared they specifically took publications that looked at doctors versus algorithms. So just, relatively narrow look, but these are the kinds of things that we'll likely see and have seen deployed. And as you can see, the vast majority of the data is coming from 3 states. These 3 states don't necessarily, for many reasons, represent the populations across this country, certainly. And as I'll talk about next, we can really start to get ourselves into a bind when it comes to the validation and reliance on these sorts of algorithms that we have shown work in these distributed populations that have disproportionately selected or used, and then trying to apply them to other places. And we're starting to run into some of those trouble. I think one of the simplest ways to get your head around some of this is just to say, let's just, there's a lot of ways we can divide up how we can look at bias, but obviously one of the most salient regions of bias is clearly going to be around the self-reported race, right? And in these figures are actually from another paper that was done by a colleague of mine, Leo Selly, out of BID. And what they try to do is they try to say, listen, we will take de-identified data, health record data, things like vital signs, labs, there's nothing really that you could imagine as a human, you could look at that series of medical data and say, okay, that person is this race or that race, right? And yet when they trained a model to try to determine race based on, again, very nebulous, sort of not necessarily descriptive health data, they were finding it was actually fairly easy to discriminate, which may be related to underlying medical practice. It may be related to other factors in terms of how folks access healthcare and use healthcare. But this is important. This is really important. And I think that we're starting to have better conversations around the need for more representative data, but then also to ensure that when we have data that we're going to use for training models and potentially using for translation, that we have a good understanding of how it performs in different subclasses, both by race or by disease or by location. That may have been something that you maybe were like, okay, I've seen that before. Well, this is something that I bet you probably haven't seen. So apologize for the difficult to read table here, but this is work that we did in collaboration with many, many others, led by Judy Gachoya out of Emory, who's a phenomenal researcher, one of my personal heroes in this space. And what the question that she asked to all of us was, can AI models that are computer vision models, can they determine race from medical images? Never would have thought, never would have crossed my mind, right? The thing that we always said to each other, those of us in the computer vision community in the clinical space, humans can't do that. I can't do that. I've been doing radiology for 20 years. I can't tell you someone's race based on their chest X-ray or their knee X-ray or the mammography or even their CT. And so it didn't even occur to us to ask this question. And what she said was, listen, we have a lot of open data sets available to us now. If we can understand the self-reported race of those data, can we ask the question? And so we said, sure, right? So we all got together and worked on this problem. This was something that I would have, I mean, if a student came to me and said, hey, I want to work on this, it sounds interesting, but I don't know if it's going to, I don't know if I spend a lot of time on it. I don't think it's going to work. And then we were all astonished at the results. So we did, I want to say 17 different experiments to continue to try to refute what we were finding, because none of us believed it. And as it turns out, we kept seeing the same answer over and over and over again. And the answer was that these models can determine race with astonishing accuracy, accuracies at levels that I have never seen in almost any other task. Even if I had a segmented, perfectly curated data set, I wouldn't see accuracy this high for validation. This was shown across populations, across countries. There was collaborators from Australia, collaborators from Europe. And this is really one of the most astonishing findings that I've seen in probably in my 5-6 years in working in this space. And really what we wanted to do with this paper is not just show that it's possible with a variety of different modalities, but also try to figure out why or how it's doing it. And so we had every possible theory you can imagine. Everyone threw in their 2 cents and then came up with an experiment, and all of our labs would independently sort of work on that and then try to generalize and see if we could find the answer. And this figure, I think, is probably one of the most stunning. So I know it's probably somewhat confusing to you. So what we did was we tried to take a low pass. So we determined that there wasn't anything that was obvious from the pixel data, right? We went through all these experiments, just we couldn't find anything. So we said maybe there's some high or low frequency signals that are better perceptible, more perceptible to the model than it is to us. We're not able to see that. Maybe there's something there. And so we actually started to put filters and degrade the image to different degrees, right? Both with low and high pass. And you can see, I don't know how well this is coming through, but I mean, listen, I think even here, maybe you can believe that there's a chest X-ray there, right? I can't imagine you believe that there's a chest X-ray there, maybe. And then certainly down to here, there's just no way. And yet the accuracy was still at 90%. It's astonishing. So the bottom line is I'm going to disappoint you because we don't have an answer. We don't have an answer for this. All the code that we used, every single lab's code is going to be made completely available. The reason this was possible to even start asking these questions was that there were enough open data sets, enough people that believed in the power of open data and the innovations and the insights that we can derive from it, that we were able to do this as a large collaboration. And so those data sets with the self-reported race labels will also be made available. The peer review version of this paper will be out in a week in the Lancet. And I hope that you have a chance to read it and help us as a community understand potentially with some insights as to why this is happening, not just because it's kind of just a phenomenal finding, but also because it may tell us something of how we can mitigate potential biases that we're not even aware of that could come up as we're deploying these systems into practice. And this kind of brings up some of the pitfalls, right, with some of the things that we've been doing, right? So you can imagine that there are going to be asymmetries. There's going to be inequities in some of the initiatives that we have proposed, right? We want to make data available. We want to do it safe and ethically. We want to do it in a way that's responsible and certainly encourages exploration, but also innovation that feeds back into the people that have contributed the data, right? And benefit everybody. What this tends to do, though, is it tends to potentially divide parts of the world that don't have the digital healthcare infrastructure in two ways. One, it makes their data, when they do have it, more valuable to these data. So we need to have a better representation of data when we're building these systems. And so it actually creates a need, right, that maybe goes above and beyond sort of the traditional data sets that we're used to seeing from the populations that we've been studying for a long time. And it can actually create systems where we're looking for the data, but there's not the proper attribution, or they're not seeing these populations that are potentially doing the work to bring the data together to contribute to these efforts. How are they going to see the benefits of that? And that hasn't necessarily been laid out very clearly. And that's something I believe the WHO and the UN have focused on very recently. And I am encouraged by a lot of the discussions that are going on to try to ensure that those that are contributing data, even if they're from parts of the world or areas where health data isn't necessarily as ubiquitous as it is in some other places, that there's still going to be opportunities to leverage that for the greater good. I think that one example of that is a company called Color Metrics, which again, with the ubiquity of the smartphone, it really provides this platform for healthcare, right? And this is an app that allows just the smartphone camera to read color-based tests for diabetes, kidney disease, urinary tract infections. There's talk about building something out for malaria, tuberculosis, but this is sort of where you grab the data, you're using it to draw larger insights, but you're finding a mechanism to provide the benefits from that back into the population in a way that can be consumed and actually drive impact. And so those are the kinds of things that I'm encouraged by. And I think that, again, the larger government and the non-government organizations are going to lead the way. All right, so let's talk about the way forward. Okay, so when we think about some of the topics that I've kind of touched on, that I'll get into just a second on where we need to go, I think that, as I've mentioned, the least sexy work is probably the most important, right? Which is collecting, cleaning the data. But we also have to define for ourselves, what does open really mean, right? I mean, you can have open data like we've done at Stanford. We just literally are putting it into it's de-identified. You're putting it out into essentially an open location where any researcher can download and use the data. That's one way. But not everybody can do that. There are government regulations, there are privacy regulations, there are just certainly different points of view that make that somewhat problematic. So how do we get to a place where we can have a system where we can all benefit from the data that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to aggregate it and leave it out in the open? And so there's this concept of restricted open data, which is probably more where the mimic model comes in, where there are things that, so you need, when you want to access the mimic data, you need to go through a course on protecting patient privacy, which is really important for all of us to take anyway. But nonetheless, once you've completed that, you can get permission to access and use the data. And there's other ways to restrict it, but there's this kind of middle ground. And then there's just this sort of a secure open data environment idea, which is, some people call it a walled garden. You've probably heard of this before too. You can use the data as long as it stays within the confines of the platform that it's been made available on. And obviously analytic tools are available there, and another sort of query and dashboard you can actually pull together. But all those insights need to stay within that environment. That's another way to look at open data. But let me just talk about these other points, and then we'll come back to that. One of the most critical pieces, as I started this talk with, is understanding what is in your data, right? And we have not done, I have not done, a lot of us haven't done a very good job of this initially, right? We were fixated on the task of making this data that we used to build a model available. And we didn't really consider some of the gaps that could potentially come up. And Timna Goodbrew, I'm obviously showing her paper here. You all know her. She's just incredible thought leader in this space, really innovates around every aspect of data and healthcare, and certainly AI, but broadly, not just in healthcare. And her work really had tried to set the stage of like, listen, we need to have a comprehensive understanding of what is in a given data set. And so this is, again, I refer you to this paper. We've actually tried to take this paper, data sheets for data sets, and actually create data sheets for the health data sets that we were putting together. We encourage others that are involved in this effort to consider this framework, because it's actually answering those questions will either make you realize maybe this data isn't comprehensive as I thought, but at least that would be transparent, right? And that's very clear. And so when we do projects like the one I mentioned about race detection and imaging and others, you can actually have details that maybe you wouldn't have considered when you first were putting it together. So again, critically important. But another concept that I like that came out of the Duke group, which I believe is getting a lot of traction right now, which is this idea of kind of like model cards. It's sort of like when you get a prescription or a drug or whatever, there's like facts, right? Do's and don'ts, where it can be used, where it can't be used, how it performs in different circumstances. Really just a structured content description, both for the data sets, right? You can have one of them for the data sets, but also for the model. And I actually feel like the model component of this is maybe even more useful for that, right? It's critically important for those of us, particularly if we've abstracted away a lot of the work to build the models, for those that are using it and potentially actually putting it into practice in clinic, to understand exactly what the indications for use, quote unquote, would be. And that should be based on real data, potentially prospective trials, but certainly an understanding of what went into making that model. All right, I want to touch on some of the technological shifts. So I mentioned to you that there's other ways that we can share data. And it may be that we don't need to share the data outside of our institution at all, right? And I think some of you would likely have heard about federated learning. This is kind of more maybe one step up beyond that. We're going to talk about federated learning in a second, but I wanted to introduce the concept of the data mesh, which is gaining a lot of traction right now. It's kind of a new term for a relatively older concept, but the bottom line is that it allows a few things. It allows, number one, the data governance and whatever restrictions you may have, patient consent, certain de-identification protocols, whatever. It allows you to keep that in your own space, right? In your own healthcare system or your own clinic or wherever you happen to be with the data. But then there's this opportunity to either network different groups together or to provide an analytics or even potentially a query and temporary storage layer on top of that system that allows permission from each of those governance groups to access the data in the way that they prefer, in the way that they require, but still is able to harmonize and structure the data at a higher level to allow the other external parties to come in and, again, run analytics to learn from the data, potentially even, download portions of it depending on the permissions. This is a very, very, very attractive concept. It does require a pretty significant amount of infrastructure, and it also requires a third party for the most part. And you can imagine that there are opportunities here to partner with technology companies, other groups that have sophisticated sort of infrastructure to sort of partner with satellite groups to really put these kinds of data mesh ideas and concept into practice. And I think this is an incredibly powerful way forward. I mentioned federated learning. Let's just talk about that. So this kind of merges the transfer learning and federated components together, right? So the idea here is you've got a central model that is going to be sent to a data set, and then it's going to, train on that, bring those weights back, and then bring it to another data set, right? That's kind of the general thought. And so from a hospital perspective, you can imagine, again, a central location that's sort of helping to federate what is essentially a model that has learned the information that it needs to from a given hospital data set. The data stays in place and the model moves around. This is, again, another very attractive, but requires a fairly high amount of sophisticated infrastructure and compute. And so while it may look nice on a diagram, there are some devils in the details in terms of making sure everyone's harmonized their data structures, right? They've harmonized their labels. There are some things here that potentially a data mesh approach could potentially help us solve. Another thing I want to talk about is synthetic data. So these are not real people. I'm sure you've seen lots of articles about this. If you're in this space, you understand the mechanism of generating fake images, right? It's astonishingly good. It's getting better. I'm sure many of you heard about some of the controversies and the pitfalls of the deep fakes and things like that. This is based on a GAN. There's many other architectures now, of course, that you could potentially look at. But in general, it's the idea that you're taking essentially low dimensional latent space or random noise to start, and you're iteratively learning how to find a series of pixels in this space that match the feature space of the actual real images. So in other words, you have this kind of ball of features that is composed by the real data, and then the generator is trying to find points that can fit inside of there that would pass as potentially an image. Now, these are some synthetic chest X-rays. They're not very good. I couldn't find a better example, but there are some fantastic synthetic data work that's going on that look much more realistic than this. But this is just to give you the concept. I actually like this a lot. There are some pitfalls, right, in terms of you can generate a massive amount of synthetic data, but remember that conceptually you're still drawing from the same feature space. So if you really do need to find a lot more data points that potentially expand that feature space, right, to like data from another population that may have some differences that doesn't necessarily fit within that initial group, it's problematic, right? But if you can imagine that you could oversample some of the components of that feature space that relate to rare diseases, right, things that you don't see very often, to sort of bootstrap an opportunity for a model to have more examples of something less common, I think that's a pretty awesome opportunity. Another thing that I wanted to point out too is that, from what we learned from ImageNet is that, being able to leverage competition really engages the community. So if we want folks to work on difficult problems, there's very few things that are more incentivizing than competition, right? So Kaggle, there's many others, Grand Challenge, there's a whole list of these where, again, machine learning practitioners can come to this space. They can learn about a use case. They can actually compete and potentially drive innovation. And that's another way to engage with the kind of data that we're talking about generating. One last thing I'll mention before we wrap up is the idea around education. So one of the biggest gaps that have been identified in both the World Health Organization reports and the UN reports has been a lack of education. Now, the trouble is the barrier to entry is high. If you have to learn to code, if you have to learn linear algebra, again, if you're already in the healthcare space, it's going to be a big lift. But what we've tried to do, at least at Stanford, we started teaching a course. We made it available on Coursera. There's others working around this. Obviously, Andrew Ng, many other luminaries in the field are starting to find opportunities to teach the fundamental concepts and principles of machine learning, the pitfalls, where it works, where it does it, about data, statistics, just high level stuff, to folks that don't have that engineering or computer science background. I think this is a fantastic effort. Obviously, I'm biased, of course, but I would say that this is one of the ways we're going to unlock the opportunities that we're all hoping to see happen in the future, is by really driving education amongst all of those of us in healthcare that didn't come initially with a computer science background. So I'll end with just some open questions. I think that this is a popular movement. I think, again, the pandemic has accelerated this like it has many other things, both making us take a hard look at ourselves and our infrastructure and what really matters to us when it comes to our data, but then also the accelerations and the innovations that we've seen when data was shared, right? The genome of the virus was shared early. It was able to be turned into a vaccine in just astonishing amount of time, right? These kinds of ideas, right? Sharing the data together to derive insights on clinical trials, which drugs work, which drugs don't, et cetera. But there's still some persistent questions, right? What about patient privacy? Who really owns this data? These are not solved problems. Is there legislative support? Everybody has their own opinions on these things. And I think that while there's this will and there's clearly a need and a use case, we still have a lot to sort out. And I definitely would turn to communities like this and others to encourage and to participate in this discussion, because it is going to take folks from all kinds of different disciplines to both recognize the importance and the power of open data and the transformations it can unlock, but also to find potentially new and innovative ways to do this in a way that sort of satisfies the privacy that we owe our patients and democratizes the innovations that we come up with, so that we can start to solve some of the inequities that have been propping up as healthcare has advanced in some places and not in others. So I'll end with that. I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, and it looks like we have a little bit of time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. That was fantastic. On behalf of everyone, thank you very much. Such an important topic, and I'd like to take the privilege to ask the first question. And as questions come in, please, everyone in the neural network, post your questions. If we don't have time now, we can log in and answer them in the neural network. So Matt, I wonder, when will, based on your last statement, when will people appreciate that, apart from celebrating all the achievements that AI has unlocked, that essentially it comes down to, it's all about the data? And when will the politics, the hospitals, when will Epic and all other, data insurance providers appreciate the power of data, even though it's not in their interest, even potentially apart from insurance purposes, to gather it and make it available?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, again, if we had been having this discussion in 2019, I'd be a lot less optimistic. But I think, again, when we try to look at silver linings of just where we are right now, I think, as I was sort of ending with, we have all companies, healthcare practitioners, even patients, had to take a hard look at this a little, right? Because we realized when the emergency came, when we needed it most, right, we were not able to rise to the occasion, right? We tried our best, but we immediately recognized all the things that we weren't able to do. And I think that was a hard learned lesson, but it has accelerated now these conversations. I'm no longer hearing, why should we do this, as much as I'm now hearing, how can we do this? And again, that's not going to be easy, right? Because again, it's lots of different things to consider. However, people are engaged. Healthcare systems are engaged in this problem. Companies are engaged in this problem. And I think everyone is starting to at least align, despite that they have different interests, onto the end vision, the goal, right? The goal is to find ways to get data ethically and responsibly in the hands of people that can innovate with it. And if we keep that in mind, which I think is really the case, it doesn't necessarily matter which platform, which place, as long as we are keeping some of these principles in mind.
Okay. So Naomi Bennett was asking, she says, I represent a patient charity, and we're exploring data and insight models that protect our supporters while also driving forward the research and innovation. So she's asking, do you know of any examples of people, of patient charity groups doing this well? The question is also in the chat window if you want to read it yourself.
Good question. You're talking about like NGOs that are able to leverage their data to drive insights. Yeah, I think so. I think there's a few. I think I can't remember the name right off the top of my head. It's a great question. I think there's some efforts around tuberculosis and global health where they've actually been collecting data that they've been using for years, right? Both for defining certain criteria. I'm thinking mainly about the imaging space, chest x-rays for screening, for active TB, where they've actually said, listen, we have this massive data set. are there ways that we can actually work with some of the startups and other companies that are developing algorithms to create a system where we don't need to have a human expert radiologist, right, in everywhere in the country? We can actually democratize that knowledge, right? As long as there's an ability to get an X-ray, we can actually start to help clinicians make better decisions at the point of care. That's the kind of example that comes to mind off the top of my head. I think that I think in general, and again, I'm not sure which charity or NGO you're referring to, but in general, there wasn't at least historically a lot of thought put into how are we collecting and organizing data. It's just that we have it and we use it when we need to, but that's not going to get the job done. You're going to end up with these fragmented silos. So thinking ahead and say, how do I future-proof my organization's ability to collect and secure health data, but then also derive insights from it? And so there may be some systems that need to be put in place with a variety of partners or wherever in order to really achieve that. That'd probably be my best suggestion.
And also maybe thinking further, if you apply to grants, any type of grant, I think it's really difficult to just say, I want to gather and collect this amazing data set, which will be so valuable, but I don't think anyone's going to fund this, just like that. So funding data sets.
Yeah, that's a good point. Competitions and call for proposals. Actually, that's a fantastic suggestion. That's one of the best ways, right, to get engaged with the community. In fact, if you have a niche use case and you put a challenge around or a small proposal for grant, you actually get a lot of people suddenly interested in that problem that maybe didn't know about it, right? Yeah.
So Reinhard was asking, how, as a patient, how can I make my MRI or X-ray scan publicly available? If you go to the doctor, you get the data on a CD-ROM, if you can still read that at your laptop, or you receive a link to the data. Is there any place you can donate your data?
Yeah, this is a big conversation. So I'm involved in some of the larger radiology society conversations. We have this campaign called Ditch the Disc, which is really just to try to encourage, potentially even start to get to a point where we're going to regulate the sort of common practice of making it very hard even to have possession of your own data, right? I mean, I still have to get a CD, right? I have to bring it to another specialist, and I'm in the space. So yes, the answer is yes. There are initiatives that are put together. What we want to do though is we want to make sure that any of these initiatives that are allowing folks to provide their data, and again, there's a way to do that. It doesn't necessarily get us to the place where we need to be, which is that we have to have these large data sets that are organized in the same kind of way, where there's some interoperability. The concern would be that, are we going to fragment again at the patient level, which is even more distributed? Both the inequities, right, of folks that would be more likely to share and others that wouldn't, but then also potentially have many different versions and labels or types of data that we're putting into these spaces that we have to then clean up at the aggregation or the larger layer. So the answer really is that we're not quite at that place. I think that efforts like in the UK are probably maybe the gold standard at this point, where they're allowing folks to provide permissions for their genome, for all their health data to be pulled into some of these larger efforts. And I think that you'll be seeing a lot more of these in the future. So being able to just say, click to agree, my data can be used in a de-identified fashion for research and education, or potentially even for commercial use, right? You can have that decision with your healthcare provider.
Okay, thank you. And last question by Chris. With all the data breaches we keep hearing about, is it likely that medical data can be collected, stored, and used in a trustable way for patients?
It's a big problem, right, for us, and it's probably one of the biggest barriers that we encounter. The last thing we need, like, all this momentum is moving forward. We have made a lot of data available. Knock on wood, we haven't seen the kind of things that you're describing, but it's probably a matter of time, right? And it's a matter of how well we can prepare ourselves for that eventuality, right? So are we de-identifying appropriately? Are we ensuring that the patient's aware that this data is being used in this fashion, right? And I think that it's just like when you take a new medicine, there's going to be risks and benefits. I think that it's going to fall into that category where you have to accept some measure of risk in order to say, I believe in this public good concept to the point where I am willing to risk whatever % chance that my data might be breached or potentially used other ways, that I believe in that so much that I'm willing to take that risk. And I think that in aggregate, we can get to that place. But our de-identification methods, have been fantastic, right? And so we've been lucky so far. But to your point, if I was talking about identified data, that equation starts to be a little different. So yeah.
All right, we're at the hour. Matt, thank you again for joining us today. Matt and I will log onto the neural network in a minute to interact with you, answer your questions. Please keep posting them. We'll respond to them. I'd like to thank again, Matt, for giving this amazing talk, to all sponsors of AI for Good, all my colleagues at ITU and AI for Good in the backstage who helped make this possible, and the co-conveners Switzerland of AI for Good. With that said, thank you again. Have a good rest of the day, and looking forward to network with you on the neural network. Bye, everyone.
Bye, thanks.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the satisfaction survey, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. After the 30-minute networking session, we invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits and poster boards, and build your personalized AI for Good program. It was a pleasure learning with you today. See you at the next AI for Good.